In this video, we'll be taking a look at a new setting book for D&D 5th edition, Van Richten's Guide to Ravenloft. This video is sponsored by Griot's Guide to the Wildlands by Next Level D&D, which is currently on Kickstarter. If you've ever wanted more robust rules and tools for wilderness and survival encounters for your D&D game, Griot's Guide to the Wildlands has you covered. It will feature several unique biomes and hazards like flash floods, forest fires, and more, enabling you to make travel a more meaningful part of your D&D 5th edition adventures. They have stretch goals for tons of great environments, mechanics, and monsters that we can all get in the finished book. So definitely go check out the Kickstarter link in the video description. Hi everybody, my name is Nate, and you are watching WASD20, a channel about tabletop RPGs and fantasy maps. In this video, we'll be taking an in-depth look and flipping through the pages of Van Richten's Guide to Ravenloft. Now, this video is not a full review. The book has only been out a few days now, and I haven't had time to read the whole thing, so I'll be giving you an overview of the book and sharing my impressions based on what I have read so far. And hopefully by the end of the video, you'll have a pretty good feel for what's in the book. So let's get down to the table and take a look. All right, so here we have it. First off, cover. Nailed it. I've been pretty underwhelmed by a lot of the recent released covers, and this one I think is just great. So, well done on that one, Watsy and Anna Podedwarna, or something like that. So we're going to spend quite a bit of time talking about Chapter 1 here, just for those of you who might not know that much about Ravenloft, like I didn't before I got this book. So, what are we talking about here? Well, Ravenloft is also known as the Domains of Dread, or the Plane of Shadow, or Shadowfell. It basically consists of a bunch of domains that are separated by these mists. And it's not in the material plane like the real world, if you will, of Dungeons and Dragons. These are small demi-planes that are separated by the mists. And I like how they describe it here as nightmare logic. There are going to be a lot of things that don't make sense, a lot of strange, crazy, and creepy things. And the inhabitants of these demi-planes might even be doing things that don't make sense. Why does everyone tolerate this? Why isn't anyone else asking these questions? And the reason is, it's nightmare logic. It's a strange, dreamlike place where the inhabitants don't really know any better. These 7 secrets of Ravenloft form these pillars. Each domain is controlled by a Dark Lord, and the Dark Lord is the ruler of the realm in a way, but also is a prisoner of that realm and is eternally tormented there. I really do like how they have lots of these little notes between some of the major NPCs or adventurers here in Ravenloft, and kind of little correspondence between them really help set the tone for what sorts of adventures and strange things you can expect. So for a newcomer to Ravenloft like me, I do own Curse of Strahd, but I've never actually read it or run it. This was really helpful in terms of setting the scene. I found Chapter 1 to be right up my alley, and it weighs in at just about 10, 11 pages, so I think that's great. And we already get into character creation here on page 13 for Chapter 1. So I'm just going to hit some of the highlights here. What are we talking about? First off, we've got some very basic information about creating characters for Ravenloft, and I think there's some great advice on the sort of character you might want to create and how to roleplay that character. And one of the things that they mention is creating a character that has some fears and playing into that and acting scared in certain moments. Rather than playing some real brave hero who's never afraid of anything, that doesn't really lend itself to a horror campaign. So playing into the horror aspect is valuable. They also do mention some stuff about fear and kind of like the content warnings you might want to discuss. We'll get to that a little bit more in Chapter 4, but they do mention that in the introduction as well. Just talking about horror and, how to kind of be careful with that and set expectations. There are a few new options available for character creation, and one of those is these lineages. There are 3 different lineages. They are things that can replace your race, but you still might be an elf or a dwarf or a human, and then you can slowly add in and replace some of your racial traits with some of these lineage traits. Or you can start with the lineage traits from the beginning. That's a conversation you want to have with your dungeon master. But the Dampier is sort of a feral beast-like vampire-related creature of sorts. So perhaps you play a human or a dwarf or an elf, but you have survived being attacked by a vampire but were forever changed. Or some of these other possible origins here. They do get a vampiric bite, and that's pretty cool. Another option would be the Hexblood, which is more Fey related and really more related to the hags. So maybe seeking a child, your parent made a bargain with a hag. You are the result of that arrangement. So the Hexbloods do have some traits that are related to the hags, and they do get hex magic. The Reborn are somewhat undead, kind of ghost-like, or perhaps zombie-like. You rose out of the grave, or you woke up in a laboratory, some strange experiment cobbled together, almost a flesh golem of sorts. And this deathless nature does provide you with certain benefits, like, for example, advantage on death saving throws, or not needing to eat, drink, or breathe. So anyway, those are the 3 lineages that the book contains, and I think those are going to be attractive options for players to make a character that fits well in this setting and is kind of ripe for a horror game. Dark gifts are also new features. I really like these. They're basically little features that give you somewhat of a benefit, but also a drawback, and it could be the result of a dark bargain you made. So, for example, let's look at the first one here, Soul Echoes. You get some features. You get proficiency in 2 skills of your choice, inherent tongue. You can get some additional languages, but you have to put up with these intrusive echoes so that when you roll a 1 on an ability check or saving throw, you will suffer one of these intrusions. You're charmed by a creature you can see, of the DM's choice, for 1 minute, or until the creature damages you, etc., etc. So anyway, lots of cool options here for the dark gifts. I think there's maybe 8 of them total. A lot of them do involve being haunted in some way, or being touched by the dark powers of Ravenloft. The dark powers are a theme throughout here. You can think of the dark powers sort of like more abstract deities, these kind of forces of evil in Ravenloft that draw people into these domains and keep the Dark Lords trapped in these domains. There are also some new subclass options. You've got the Bard College of Spirits, and we've got the Warlock the Undead. So the College of Spirits basically draws on ghost-like being spirits that kind of tell their tales, and that gives you certain powers as a bard. And then we've got the Warlock Undead Patron, means that you are beholden to perhaps a vampire or a lich or something like that, and that could even be one of the Dark Lords of the domain that gives you your power. For backgrounds, we do get a few new background features that can be used to replace your background feature from the player's handbook or whatever background you're using, and you get these personality traits, ideals, bonds, and flaws that you can also just kind of swap in for some of your stock soldier or criminal or whatever personality traits or bonds or flaws. And then we get 2 new complete backgrounds as well, the Haunted One and the Investigator. And all of these background features here just help, again, kind of tie your character to the setting a little bit more and help you make characters that are kind of on tone for a horror campaign. Horror trinkets can do that as well. Not all of them are incredibly horrific, but some of them are definitely very, very creepy. All right, Chapter 2 is all about creating domains of dread, and one of the things I really like here is their encouragement to create your own domain. Yes, we are going to see that in Chapter 3. There are lots and lots of domains here. I think there are about 22 total, if I remember correctly, 22 different domains, each one having their own map, a description of the Dark Lord, some of the hallmarks, a little bit about the genre of horror, things like that. All of these are in general going to be like 4 to 6 pages for the most part. And you also get some shorter descriptions here at the end for other domains of dread that are just like 1 or 2 paragraphs, just kind of giving you a little bit that then you would want to flesh out on your own more. So again, those are all a great inclusion. Those make up a significant portion of this book, but I will say I really like the encouragement to create your own and the tools that they give you to do that. So you can build your own Dark Lord first. And they actually encourage you to create a Dark Lord that reflects your player characters in some way. What are their favorite or kind of most key personality traits, ideals, and bonds? And how can you kind of play on those with the Dark Lord you create so that it's going to be maybe a natural enemy or create some natural conflict? So then they have these questions that you can answer to help flesh out your Dark Lord. They give you some ideas for fatal flaws, monstrous transformations, and yes, my book has a big blue stripe here. It's kind of faint, but that happened on a couple pages. I pre-ordered this on Amazon, by the way. I don't know if anyone else has the same issue, but it's pretty minor. But anyway, lots of tools here for developing your Dark Lord, and then also some more information for creating your domain. What are the hallmarks of this domain? What sorts of torment will you find? What sorts of culture are you going to be dealing with here? And even what sorts of monsters or adventures or adventure locations might you find in this domain? Then we've got a bunch of descriptions on genres of horror, which it might be good to get a little bit more specific than horror. And I really appreciate that, because I'm not super into horror. I enjoy it, but I haven't really thought of the various genres of horror that much. And I think that can be useful for really nailing a specific tone, coherent tone for the domain that you create. So body horror, dealing with zombies and gibbering mouthers and Frankenstein's monster sort of stuff in general. Cosmic horror, dealing with the alien and sort of psychological stuff like Grell and Beholders and Mind Flayers and things like that. Dark fantasy, which is sort of your typical D&D fantasy, but let's make it darker. Let's bring it down a notch a little bit to that horror. Then you've got folk horror as well, which is going to be more in line with fairy tales and folklore and traditions and things like that. Ghost stories, pretty self-explanatory there. You've got gothic horror, which is going to be maybe a little bit more on the Curse of Strahd sort of vibe in Barovia, gothic horror. And then you've got some shorter descriptions of some other tones that you might want to explore here in terms of disaster horror, occult detective stories, psychological horror, and slasher horror. And that is Chapter 2. So about 20 pages there for Chapter 2, creating a domain of dread. Chapter 3, the domains of Ravenloft. We get some general description here about some of the basics and things that these settings might have in common and how they're linked. And then we get to the actual featured domains, which I've already talked about a little bit. I do really appreciate the maps here. We've got some Mike Schley maps, and then you've also got quite a few Jared Blando maps. So between those two, got some really nice maps of each of these. And a lot of great descriptions, adventure locations, and ideas, things like that. Since I already talked about those quite a bit, let's get into the Travelers in the Mist section. So here we have various organizations that you might find in Ravenloft, and then you also have some Mist Wanderers, which are major NPCs, kind of these quintessential adventurers, some of those kind of iconic NPCs that your players might run into or might read about, things like that. All right, Chapter 4 and 5 left here. Chapter 4 is all about horror adventures. So if you don't want to run games in Ravenloft, I think there's still a lot for you in this book in terms of writing your own horror adventures and running them. Just kind of things you'll want to consider. There's definitely a lot about the session zero and consent and establishing boundaries. How far is too far? What's the difference between, scaring the characters and scaring the players? And where does the group want to land on those things? Now, it mentions the session zero info in Tasha's Cauldron of Everything, which is totally fine, but there's lots of free information out there. Just go Google session zero RPG. You'll find lots of good stuff. Or the Consent in Gaming booklet is a decent resource from Monty Cook Games as well. So anyway, stuff like that you'll want to consider. And then just things about nailing the tone and what sorts of things you want to keep in mind for really getting the ambiance right and minimizing distractions, the role of the dungeon master and what you should expect from your players, pacing, describing horror. So some really good resources here, and it's only really from page 185 to about 190, so only about 5 pages, but some good basic info for running horror adventures. You also get this bit on the Taroka deck, which is a deck that is actually used in Curse of Strahd and can be used here in Ravenloft as well, and therefore makes sense for the rest of Ravenloft as well. And then you've got the Spirit board, which is similar to the Ouija board, and they actually have one of those right here in the appendix. Then you get some actual kind of resources that you can slot into your games. Things like curses, which are cool. Things like fear and stress and actual mechanics for that. This is something that I found to be really cool, and I would definitely use this if I were going to run any Ravenloft stuff, because I think it really can add to your game and give it a unique feel. Haunted traps. These are so creepy. I love them. And then they have this little advice on survivors. So if you want to, run a one-shot, if you want to do a little bit more of a simple game, you don't have to come in with these fully fleshed out characters with all these abilities and spells. You could just play a survivor, a little bit maybe more on the mundane side. It actually kind of reminds me a little bit of Monster of the Week, the Mundane, just kind of an average person. You can use the Apprentice, Disciple, Sneak, or Squire stat block, but then there's certain things you can add, and they talk about, levels and hit points and certain talents and things like that, which can be helpful. So I thought that was pretty interesting because often I think that can fit the tone of horror a little bit better than making some awesome hero. And the last section of chapter 4 here, the House of Lament. I gotta tell you, I was so happy to see they actually included an adventure. It's great to have those domains. They give you plenty to set up your own adventures, but I really appreciate that they include one here written out for you. It is a first to third level adventure. I will admit I have only read these 2 pages here and then kind of skimmed the rest, so I haven't run it. I don't know how good it is, but I'm really glad they included one, and it does sound really cool and creepy. So that is about 20 pages of the book, and then we get to the monsters of Ravenloft, and I very much have a love-hate relationship with the monster section here because they are so creepy. But yeah, just flipping through this monster section here will give you a feel for the creepy, crazy things that, yeah, let's just not dwell on that page. Anyway, small handful of really cool monsters that are very, very creepy. This vampiric mind flayer here. This, I think this is maybe a zombie clot. I don't know. That's, wow. And that's the book. So overall, my impressions of the book are very favorable so far. I really like what I'm seeing here. I think this book could work for people in 2 different ways. If you want to run games in these domains in Ravenloft, then I think there's a lot of cool stuff here. There are a huge variety of different settings depending on your preferred flavor of horror and fantasy, and there's also tools for building your own. And that's where I think you can really get something out of this book. Even if you don't want to run games in Ravenloft, there's some good advice and some good tools for running horror games in general. However, I will say if you really want to run horror games, I think there are better systems that are built from the ground up for that purpose than Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. That's just the reality. I know a lot of you just want to play D&D 5e, and if you want to play a horror version of that, great, this is your book. However, some other games that I've recently picked up that I think are worth checking out, I think Vaesen is an awesome one. It's from Free League. It's got this kind of Nordic folk horror vibe. And another one I recently picked up is Monster of the Week, which is maybe a little less kind of dark and sinister, but still very cool. Of course, there's Call of Cthulhu as well, which has its very own brand of horror. And anyway, I would love to hear other suggestions that you have down in the video description too, because there are tons of games that I think, again, are better suited to horror. But still, I think you can have a lot of fun with D&D 5th edition horror. For those of you who have played Curse of Strahd or have even run some other horror games in 5th edition, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that as well. Before we go, I do want to thank the WASD20 patrons for their support. Patrons are people who support the channel on a monthly basis. I couldn't do what I do without these amazing people. They get access also to weekly live map drawing streams with me, campaign diaries for my ongoing Icewind Dale campaign, and lots of other cool stuff. So go check it all out over at patreon.com/WASD20. All right, that's going to do it for this one, everybody. Take care. You'll see me again very soon.